Hello, it's Keith here again. So today I'm going to talk about writing for the reader. And with all academic writing, a key point is to remember that you are writing to make it as easy as possible for the reader to read the text, but also understand the key findings of your research, and to do this as quickly as possible. So this means that to write a good paper, it can be hard for the writer. So I'm going to go through the sections of a paper and just give you a few tips to hopefully make this easier for you to do. So the title, this needs to be clear, concise, and a good thing to do is think about this as a sort of advertising slogan for your research. And then the abstract, this will be short, it will have your key findings, but it's also really important to remember that you put in what you have found out that's different here. Emphasize difference. That's what's going to get people to read your research and publish your research. Then the highlights, these will quickly show the main points of your research. Now, if you can't do this quickly in the highlights and simply, the reader is going to know that they're going to find it very hard to find out any relevant information to them in the discussion. So it's really important that you do these well to entice, to tempt the reader into looking at the rest of your paper. Because if they don't look at the rest of your paper, they are never going to cite it, and you want to be cited. That's the aim. Now, for the rest of the paper, two parts of it, the introduction and discussion, quite often have a structure when they're thought of together as an hourglass or a sand timer. So they start broad at the top with global in the introduction, then you focus in on local at the end of your introduction, what you are studying. And then you come to the discussion. In the discussion, quite often you discuss what's going on locally with your study, and then you broaden it out to globally. Now, you don't have to do this, but I would recommend it, certainly thinking about it, because for a reader, in a way, it's a structure that they understand and they're used to, in a way that people read thrillers or romantic novels. They all have much the same structure, but the interesting thing in your paper or a romantic novel is what is different. That is what is interesting. So this should not be a problem if you use it. It should be a benefit. So as I said, with the introduction, you start globally, you go locally, but make sure you're ending up with what your research question is. What the focus of your paper is, again, to draw the reader into reading the rest of the paper. Next, it's the methods. Now, remember, with the methods section, what a methods section is there to do is to allow another researcher to repeat your research if they want to. So, where you are using a standard method, for example, all you have to do really is very briefly cite that standard method. It is where you are changing things or there's differences that the reader wants detail. Otherwise, they don't want detail. So commonly, I would add extra detail on calibration of instruments and also storage of samples. These are really critical to repeating a study, but also anyone who reviews this, if they're a good reviewer and these details are missing, they will ask for them. And bear in mind that a poor methodology is a very common reason for your paper being rejected. So think long and hard before you start your research. Is your method section good? And also quite often, if you're doing something environmental, it's good to start the method section with a subsection on the study area. So a bit of background information about the geography, the topography, the oceanography, the climatology of the area that you're in. And also this means that you're keeping this kind of broad descriptive detail out of the introduction, where it will be distracting for the reader and will make them less likely to read the rest of the paper. So next, thinking about the results section. So in the results, it's really critical that the figures are easy to understand and easy to compare with each other. So think long and hard about whether you can use, the same dates, for example, on the x-axis, whether you can rescale the y-axis so it's easy to compare plots of different parameters. And this will really help you support your discussion. Also, only include data in your results that you discuss. If the results are not discussed, they should not be in your results section. Everything has to be discussed. Now, a common mistake that you might make then is putting all of your results in your results section and discussing all of them. You don't want to do this. You want to have the results that you need to support your discussion. And if the results don't support your discussion, don't contribute to your discussion, simply get rid of them. Now, this is really hard to do psychologically. You've spent a lot of time, a lot of work getting these results, but unfortunately, you will really have to think long and hard, and if that is the case, get rid of them. It is not the reader's job to choose what is the relevant data from your results section and understand how it links to your discussion. It is your job to make it as easy for them as possible. So next, we'll have the discussion. As I said earlier, it's often quite useful to start locally and then move globally to help with the flow. And you should also think about breaking your discussion into 3 to 5 subsections of the different areas that you are interested in, but also think hard about how these subsections link with each other. The subsections should flow from one to another. And then within each subsection, quite commonly, what I would do is you start by using your discussion to compare with other results, i.e. how similar they are, but you have to show where there's differences. It's the differences that are most important and most interesting. So build up from the similarities, but end with the differences, how you are building on that knowledge. And then you will end up the discussion talking about the weaknesses. This isn't a negative thing. This is where you're saying future work is needed to be done. And then in the conclusion, you are broadening out your local or regional findings globally. What is the relevance to someone who is working in a completely different continent, to a completely different hemisphere for you? How can this be relevant to them? So think about how you can broaden it out to an international audience, because any high impact journal will be looking to have an international readership. So it has to be interesting internationally. So lastly, just thinking about the overall readability of the paper. First of all, it's really important that your document contains nothing in the way the English is written that annoys the reader. So this could include typographical errors, or in the results it might include having really small fonts in the figures so they're not easily read. So it's really important that you do a super thorough proofread of your document before you submit it, so there are none of these in there. But also it's important to write concisely and clearly. Now, I understand that this is very difficult to do. It's very difficult for someone who's a native English speaker. But as a tip, try and remember that you are writing for someone who may not have English as a first language. Now, someone who has an expert but not fluent level of English, which is what most readers will have, typically has a vocabulary of around 5,000 words. So when you're choosing words and when you're thinking about how you write your English, try and bear this in mind and think about word frequency as well as using a thesaurus. So a very good website that I sometimes use to see how frequent a word is used, to see how commonly someone else might understand it, is wordandphrase.info. So let's give an example where this might be used. Now, a word that you sometimes hear when people are trying to sound a bit clever, a bit posh, is ascertain. So we could say, for example, in this study we prioritised ascertaining the location at which the River Nile commenced. So it's a really slightly long-winded and pompous way of doing this. So let's think about other words for ascertain. So ascertain has a frequency in the English language of being the 9,785th most common word. It's an unusual word. So already I'm thinking I'd be keen not to use this. Now, if you type that into a word frequency website, or maybe use a thesaurus to get some ideas of words and then put these into the word frequency website, suggested alternatives are determine or discover. So determine has a frequency of 773rd most used word in the English language, and discover is the 957th most used word in the English language. So they're just much more common words and people are much more likely to understand it. So your English is clearer, it's clearer to the reader. So playing around with that sentence that I did before, where I've changed some other vocab just to show how we can get it a bit clearer as well as the structure. So we've gone from, in this study we prioritised ascertaining the location at which the River Nile commenced. Now I would simply put this as, the aim of this study was to determine the source of the River Nile. Hopefully that gives you a feeling for how you can play around with word frequency to get your English to be clear and concise. So hopefully this video has been useful, and please always remember the easier it is for the reader, the harder it is for the writer, but the positive is the more citations that you will get and the higher the impact, the journal that you can submit your article to. So thanks for watching. If you have any suggestions or comments, please leave them below. Like and subscribe if you want to, and thank you for your time.